Hi guys, so welcome to this session of Secure Your Hacks Bug Hunting series. And today we will gonna learn about authentication and authorization flaws. So we will first clear some basics and then we will gonna look some really amazing reports, really informational reports along with the exploitation of some bugs. So authentication and authorization are fundamental concepts in cybersecurity. Authentication involves verifying the identity of user, system, or you can say application, typically through passwords, biometrics, or two-factor authentication. Authorization, on the other hand, is about granting or denying access to resource-based or predefined rules or permissions. Uh, we can say access control mechanism like role-based access control play a crucial role in managing authorization. Authentication vulnerabilities can leave applications exposed to threats. Weak passwords, such as easily guessable or commonly used ones, pose a significant risk. Additionally, credential reuse across multiple accounts amplifies the consequences if one account is compromised. Brute force attacks, on the other hand, where attackers repeatedly try different passwords, are also a big concern. One more example we can take, like OTP bypass, can also be an example of these kind of bugs. So let's explore a specific kind of authentication vulnerability, password guessing. In this scenario, an attacker tries to guess a user's password to gain unauthorized access. They may use common passwords, dictionary attacks, or brute forcing techniques to crack the password. So if successful, the attacker gains access to the account, enabling them to impersonate the user and carry out malicious activities. Yeah. Let's get into one more example of OTP bypass vulnerability for which we have this really informational HackerOne report. And after this, we will gonna see some practical implementation of this bug as well. So this HackerOne report contains OTP authentication bypass vulnerability discovered during the account registration process. So this discovery highlights the importance of understanding how attackers can exploit weaknesses in web applications. So let's dive into the details of this report. Imagine this scenario: you visit a website and decide to register. The process seems straightforward, requiring you to choose between registering as an academic coach or needing an academic coach. You proceed by entering your email and creating a password. Obviously, the next step prompts you to provide your name and mobile phone. So far, so good. Now, here's where the vulnerability comes into play. In the fourth step, you receive a verification code via email to verify your account. But what if I told you that an attacker could bypass this verification process? Sounds alarming, right? So in this HackerOne report, the security researcher discovered a flaw that allowed them to change the verification code status from false to true by intercepting the request using burp suite. They modified the code and successfully bypassed this verification process. So let's understand this exploitation part in simple words. So we can say that you register to the website and verification codes comes to your email. But to bypass this, you can simply enter a random verification code and intercept its request to the burp suite. Now in this tool, we have an option to see a response of any request. So we will gonna see how server responded to our random verification code. So obviously it is wrong, we know that, and in the response we are getting false, which means the code is wrong. So now let's bypass this manipulating this status from false to true and forward this response. Now we can see we have successfully bypassed the verification process by entering wrong OTP. So this is how an OTP authentication bypass vulnerability works, and the exploitation is really easy. We can manipulate responses from false to true, or we can say that we are fooling to the server that this input code is right and you can accept this as a valid code. Now let's consider the severity and implications of such an authentication bypass vulnerability. This type of flaw is categorized as high or critical, indicating significant risk it poses. An attacker could exploit this vulnerability remotely from an external location and gain unauthorized access to user accounts. This account takeover could serious consequences, as an adversary could compromise any user's account without requiring any privileges. Now let's move to the next part, which is on privilege escalation and authorization vulnerability. Now, privilege escalation means to gain higher privileges or access levels than they are authorized to have within a system or application. It's like having a master key to unlock restricted areas. Let's take an example. Suppose you are in the hotel and you have privileges to go in your room, but not in the other rooms. What if somehow you will figure out to get those keys to unlock other rooms, or we can say get those higher privileges? Now, there are different types of privilege escalation. The first is vertical privilege escalation. In this scenario, an attacker elevates their privileges to a higher level within the same user hierarchy. Think of it as climbing up the ladder of access. Now, there is a second one called horizontal privilege escalation. Here, the attacker assumes the identity of another user at the same privilege level. It's like taking someone else's badge to gain access. Moving to one example here in the POC where John is having the permission of normal user. Now to bypass the restrictions, he just need to change his username and UID parameter. And you can see now he is an admin. Similarly, in this report, there is a web application that allows users to register and assume different roles based on their privileges. You have the typical roles in the application like normal user and admin, each with their respective access levels and permissions. Now here as well, we can get the admin privileges by simply manipulating the role ID parameter, like shown in this image. Now in this post request, we have role ID parameter in UUID format. Now let me tell you, UUID stands for Universally Unique Identifiers. It is a standardized format for representing a 128-bit value, typically used as a unique identifier for various purposes in web applications and software systems. But now here, in this example, these UUIDs are just for normal users, not for admin roles. So we can simply replace this UUID to admin, and forwarding this request would give admin privileges to the normal user. So it is important to learn about the application before exploiting any bugs. That will give us more understanding of how any vulnerability could be exploited here. Now, these were some real-time bug bounties some people earned. So now let me open one editor where we could learn some real-time vulnerabilities. We will get under authorization and authentication part. So there are a lot of vulnerabilities and authentication and authorization we have seen, but some kind of vulnerabilities are, we can say that more oftenly you will found, and you will have to test each kind of vulnerability we will be discussing right now on every login panel, every sign up. So yeah, so first let's create a box of authorization and one box for authentication. And now we will write some vulnerabilities, some different kind of vulnerabilities, and you have to guess that which vulnerability will come under which box. OTP bypass. When we can write session fixation. These are some common vulnerabilities you will found under authentication and authorization. Insecure API controls. This is also this vulnerability is also under OWASP top 10. One we can say insecure API controls, it's okay. Another one we will see like brute force attacks, password brute forcing, or you can say directory brute force. So brute force attacks. One we will say privilege escalation. Also we can see, we can also take IDORs as a part of this. So let's write IDOR. Keep it in a center, and now let's pick it up our last vulnerability, common vulnerability, which is privilege escalation. And as I already told you, that privilege escalation has its two types. One is horizontal and one is vertical. We will be discussing each of them practically as well in the second session of this authorization and authentication. We will try doing some performing these kind of bugs, exploiting these bugs in labs. So first, let's understand each of them and why they will be coming under each of these boxes, authorization and authentication. Let me tell you first that you can find more bugs apart from these bugs that we have written here, but you will have to keep these bugs in your checklist, that how these kind of bugs you can test in some kind of applications. You will find openly OTP authentication vulnerability. You will find session cookies in each kind of application. You will find API controls in each kind of application. There were some directories as well that could be publicly accessible. So first we will see insecure API controls. So insecure API controls comes under which box? Any guesses? So yeah, we have already seen that this bug is under considered as an authorization issue because they involve weaknesses in the mechanism that govern access to resources and actions within an application or system. So authorization is the process of, like, we know, determining what actions are users or entities allowed to perform after successfully authenticated. So APIs, you all know what APIs are, but let me brief you. So APIs are interfaces and that allow different software systems to interact, exchange data. So that is why we have discussed already that this is an authorization issue. Now next is brute force attacks. So password brute force is considered an authentication issue. We all know, we have already discussed this issue under authentication part. So it is because it directly relates to the process of verifying the identity of user trying to access a system or resource, we can say. So in the context of authentication, the primary goal is to ensure that the individual attempting to log in is indeed the legitimate user and not an unauthorized entity. So brute force attacks involve systematically trying all possible combinations of characters, usually starting with common ones. You can say passwords, or when it comes to a directory brute force, so you can try different kind of directories. Some common directories we'll be discussing under directory reversal attacks. So you can also brute force the directories under application, that if you will find some information disclosure bugs in those directories if they are publicly accessible. So until the correct password is found, you can also try different kind of combinations of passwords. So this type of attack targets the authentication mechanism directly by exploiting its vulnerability to repeated login attempts. So if the attacker succeeds in guessing the correct password, they can gain unauthorized access to the user's account. And we all know the authentication process relies on the strength and complexity of passwords. There are some low severity bugs as well, like password weaker points, where we can see in the login panels or sign up buttons that if any user can even put the password without any password policy. Like password policy, you can say to keep the 8 characters, and one should be uppercase, one should be lowercase, and then numeric passwords, alphanumeric. So all the combinations should be present in the website's mechanism to have a perfect password policy. Now let's move to our third bug, which is IDOR. Now IDOR is also considered as an authorization issue because it allows attackers to access or manipulate resources directly by bypassing proper authentication checks. So as I already told you that we can exploit IDORs by by manipulating the object references. If you have some UID, if you have some MID, so if you can manipulate those ID and you will get some data, or you can update or create something in the website just by changing that object reference, then it is totally, you can exploit that, you can report that as a IDOR vulnerability. So authorization is the process, we all know, determining what actions a user or entity is allowed to perform. We have already discussed by this line. So in the context of IDOR, attackers exploit vulnerabilities that occur when an application uh, does not properly validate user inputs or enforce proper access controls. So by manipulating parameters in API calls or URLs, an attacker can access resources such as files, or you can say some critical kind of data, or you will get some profile information of any other users. You can also change the profile information of that particular user by just putting or manipulating the user ID from your profile. So this means that IDOR is an authorization issue, because directly it is trying to get some authorization data, and we are directly exploiting this issue by bypassing the proper authorization checks. So because the object reference is already validated on the authorization checks, and we are actually bypassing that UID and MID parameters, so we can totally get this bug under this authorization box. So this is called IDOR, and we will be seeing some labs as well of IDORs, some different kind of IDORs, where we'll be changing the details of any other user, or we'll be changing any other controls of some other users, or we can also get some important or critical confidential data of any other user. Now let's move to the fourth bug, which is privilege escalation. So privilege escalation is considered an authorization issue because it involves gaining higher levels of access or privileges than intended or assigned to a user. So suppose you are a normal user, and due to some bug in that particular website, you can access the information of admin, or you can change or manipulate the admin privileges to any user. So you can say it is a privilege escalation issue. So when a user or attacker exploits these vulnerabilities or weaknesses in an application or system to elevate their privileges beyond what they should have, so it becomes a privilege escalation issue. So this unauthorized elevation of privileges allows the attacker to access resources, perform actions, or you can say execute commands that are typically reserved for users with higher levels of authority. Because obviously you are getting more privileges, and you can do more things as an admin in comparison to if you are a normal user. So there are some more reasons why privilege escalation is an authorization issue. So we have discussed bypassing access controls. So by privilege escalation often occurs when an attacker bypasses or manipulates access controls to gain access to resources and gaining elevated privileges. So when the attacker exploits vulnerabilities in the authorization mechanisms to elevate their privileges, given them broader access to the system or application, or you can say the broader way they can do in that application, they can manipulate different kind of data in that application. So this is a privilege escalation. This is why it is a authorization issue. And you will also do unauthorized actions. So if you are an attacker and you can and you have a bug, that privilege escalation in that application, target application, and you can perform actions that they shouldn't be able to perform, so potentially compromising the security and integrity of that system. You can get unauthorized data access. You will be getting the if you will be getting the admin access. So obviously you have that sensitive data of the company, of that particular application, that where any file or where any passwords are keeping there, and you can then just simply exploit the RC from that particular privilege escalation, and you will be getting uh, more you will be getting more reward in this kind of bug. Now let's move to another bug, which is OTP bypass. So obviously we know that OTP bypass is an authentication issue. So just match it. Now why it is under authentication box? So let's discuss this. So it involves exploiting weaknesses in the authentication mechanism. So if the application has the mechanism of authenticated by any code or by any OTP which is coming onto your mail, or which could come in to your mobile number. So it is an authentication mechanism, and if you are exploiting weaknesses in that particular mechanism, so to gain unauthorized access to a user session, so it is a authentication issue. So specifically, the attack allows an unauthorized entity to authenticate themselves as a legitimate user. So suppose you have an account on X website with your number, and you have signed up with your number by putting the OTP which is coming into your mobile number. So what if I can also log into your account by just bypassing that particular code, by changing different kind of manipulations in that OTP parameter? So I can get the unauthorized access of your account. So there are many ways to bypass OTP, and we will be discussing these in labs as well. Now, authentication is the process, we all know, of verifying the identity of a user or system trying to access a resource. So in the access of OTP bypass, the attacker manipulates or undermines the authentication process to gain unauthorized access to a session that should have been limited to one-time use. So this is different from authorization vulnerabilities, which involves gaining access to resources or actions that a user is not allowed to access, even the proper authentication. So we have discussed this OTP bypass vulnerability, and we'll be looking at this in future as well, in upcoming sessions as well, in authentication and authorization session, where we will be performing these bugs in a lab. So we have another vulnerability, which is session fixation. So session fixation is also authentication issue. So let's match it with authentication, and we have done. So it is a type of attack where an attacker sets or fixes the session identifier or cookie of a user before they authenticate themselves. So the objective of the attack is to force the user to use a session that the attacker controls, which thus gaining unauthorized access to the user's account once the user authenticates. So here's how session fixation actually works. So the attacker, so imagine a scenario where the attacker generates a session identifiers and tricks the victim into using it as their session identifier. Then the victim authenticates themselves using the session identifier set by attacker. So since the attacker already knows the session identifier, they can use it to impersonate the victim and access their account. So they are getting the unauthorized access of their account. So it is clearly a authentication issue. So this attacks exploit vulnerabilities in the session management process, which is a part of authentication mechanism. So by manipulating the session identifier before the user is authenticated, the attacker gains unauthorized access to the user session and can potentially perform actions on behalf of the victim. So while session fixation primarily affects authentication, it can indirectly impact the authorization as well. So once the attacker gains control of the user session, they may be able to access resources or perform actions that user is authorized to do. So here is the simple way. So if you will be able to get the exploit the authentication issue, any authentication issue, you can say OTP bypass or session fixation. So then you will be able to do or perform actions and disclose the data of that particular user. So it will become a authorization issue in after the authentication issue. So, however, these unauthorized actions stem from the initial compromise of authentication process through session fixation. So this was the whole meaning of authorization and authentication and its differences and all the issues we have discussed. Now in upcoming session, we will do and perform these bugs in some labs. So that's all for this video.